In this part of the lecture, we're going to be talking about muscle tissue, nervous tissue, and then just briefly about tissue repair. So let's go back to this slide again, and let's look at the different types of muscle tissue that we have here. So there's only three types of muscle tissue. Epithelial tissue, there's a number of different types, and I want you to learn all those. Connective tissue, we saw a whole bunch. On this slide, I'm only showing you three types of epithelial, four types of connective, but there's many more. But I'm showing you all of the muscle types we have. There's only three, so there's a lot fewer here. The top here we have cardiac muscle. And one of the things I want you to be able to do is to know the differences and similarities between these types of muscles. Smooth muscle. And you can see some of the similarities and differences by just looking at these pictures here. Then finally we have skeletal muscle. Let me point a few things out here since we have them all right next to each other at this point. Notice that in skeletal muscle we have these lines you can see going up and down. Each of these are called striations. They're also found in cardiac muscle. Cardiac muscle and skeletal muscle both have striations. Smooth muscle does not have any striations. You can't see any lines in here. This is a whole cell. One muscle cell. Very long. Here's another one. Very long, thin cell. And these purple things are nuclei. So this cell, for example, we can see 1, 2, 3, it looks like one down here, 4. Skeletal muscle is multinucleated. Very long cells that are multinucleated. Some of the longest cells in our body. So for example, when you're thinking about a muscle such as the bicep, each muscle cell, even though it's microscopic, each muscle cell runs from one end of the bicep to the other end of the bicep. So very long cells. Cardiac muscle cells here, for example, this would be one cell here. So not very long cells. Here's another cell. But notice that they have these branchings in the cells that connect the cells to other cells. So single nucleus, but they're branched, and here we have these intercalated discs. Those are the areas where two cells come together. And in these intercalated discs, we have things called gap junctions. And gap junctions are just what they sound like. There's a space between that allows things in one cell to move through that space into the other cell. So basically, these cells are connected, even though there's a barrier here. That barrier has holes in it, so that these cells can communicate very easily together. This is important in cardiac muscle because we want our heart to pump all at the same time, all the cells to pump in rhythm with each other. So these gap junctions allow that to happen. If you look at smooth muscle here, it's kind of hard to pick out a cell, but the cells are spindle-shaped. Each one has a single nucleus. So they're short, spindle-shaped cells, no striations, no branching. And then the other big thing about muscle tissue types is whether they're voluntary or involuntary. Cardiac muscle is, of course, involuntary, meaning that we don't think about it. Luckily, right, we don't have to think about our heart beating in order for it to beat, because we'd be spending all day thinking about our heart beating. Anyway, so it's involuntary. Smooth muscle is also involuntary. Smooth muscle is mostly found in the digestive tract, the organs of the digestive tract, your stomach, small, large intestine. It's found around the blood vessels, your veins and your arteries in your body, the lymphatic system. All of these things where movement's occurring, but we're not thinking about that. So once, for example, the digestive system, you chew the food up in your mouth, but once you initiate that swallowing reflex, that skeletal muscle that is initiating it, but then smooth muscle takes over, and then you have no more control about what happens. It goes down your stomach and through all the way to the end. And then at the very end, you do have a little more voluntary control with the skeletal muscle at the end. Skeletal muscle is voluntary. So, let's go through these one more time. So cardiac muscle is striated, skeletal muscle is striated, smooth muscle is not. Cardiac muscle is branched, smooth muscle and skeletal muscle are not. Cardiac muscle has a single nucleus. Smooth muscle has a single nucleus. Skeletal muscle is multinucleated. Cardiac and smooth muscle are involuntary. Skeletal muscle is voluntary. There basically you have all the differences and similarities between the different muscle types. One other thing to point out here is that when we're thinking about organ systems, the muscular system, and I mentioned this before, but the muscular system is only made up of skeletal muscle. Cardiac muscle is found in the cardiovascular system, because cardiac muscle is only found in the heart. That's the only place you find it. So it's part of the cardiovascular system. Smooth muscle is found in a number of systems. The digestive system, the respiratory system, the lymphatic system, the cardiovascular system. It's found in a number of places. Now it's time to mention nervous tissue. This is the last type of tissue. And there isn't really much to say about the nervous tissue. It's found in the nervous system, composed of neurons. And when we think of the nervous system, this is what we usually think about is neurons. Neurons. They're kind of the superstars of the nervous system. But there's also nerve support cells. And we'll see this when we talk about the nervous system. And they are essential if you've heard of things like myelination, myelinating neurons. That's what one of the things that the nerve support cells do. They make it so they're the behind the scenes guys that support the neurons and make them so that they're able to function correctly. And there's actually more nerve support cells than there are neurons in our body. But the function of the nervous system is to send electrical impulses throughout the body. And this is both impulses coming in and then sending impulses back out. So if you remember the negative feedback that we talked about before, we have things that are what's called afferent and efferent pathways. So we have both sensory neurons that are connected to sensory things like our eyes, our ears, that are bringing information into our brain, and then we have neurons going away. So they have to be able to conduct impulses throughout the body. Here's an example of a neuron, and we saw this in the picture up above as well. But neurons are interesting shaped cells. They have the main cell body where the nucleus is located. And then they have these long projections, looks something like a tree with these roots or these branches coming off. We have an axon, which is a long part of the neuron where the electrical impulses go down. I mentioned that muscle cells can be very long, but neurons are the longest cells in the body. They can extend from, for example, the longest one from our spinal cord in our back. One neuron goes from the spinal cord clear down to your big toe. It's a very long cells. That's the nervous tissue. Last of all, I want to mention tissue repair or wound healing. So luckily our body is very good at regenerating our tissue when it's wounded or it's hurt in some way. But there's two possibilities here that can happen. One is called regeneration, and that is when the tissue that is hurt is actually replaced by that same type of tissue. So if you were to cut your skin, the skin would re-heal. But in the case of fibrosis, this is when instead of the same tissue being replaced, now we're getting scar tissue. We're getting connective tissue in its place. And there's some tissues that regenerate very easily. There's some tissues that do not, and you're mostly going to get fibrosis. So for example, your skeletal muscle. So we'll talk about this as well in the skeletal system, but you may, if you've ever gone to the gym or you've had a trainer or something like that, you may have heard them say you want to tear your muscles, you want to break them down in order to build them up stronger. But what they're saying is not to actually tear the cells in your muscle, because if you tear your muscle cells, they're not going to regenerate very easily, and you may end up with some scar tissue. It takes a long time to fix skeletal muscle. Cartilage also regenerates very, very poorly. Cardiac muscle, you're mostly going to get scar tissue. So when people have a heart attack, after that their heart is generally weaker because any of that tissue that may have died is going to be replaced by scar tissue. And nervous tissue, your brain, spinal cord, things like that, will often be replaced with scar tissue. Then other tissues such as epithelial tissue, connective tissue, and then we already talked a little bit about bone, they regenerate very easily. So what happens in tissue regeneration? First of all, the capillaries become very permeable. So the capillaries are the blood vessels that are carrying all this oxygen, all the nutrients that the cells need. And then also, there's the clotting factors, the clotting proteins that are found in the blood that are there to seal up that wound. So the capillaries become very permeable, the clotting process begins, and so the blood is going to stop bleeding from that area. And then the capillaries are going to give that nourishment in order to regenerate the tissue. And then we're going to have this formation of granulation tissue. What happens here is we get the growth of new capillaries. New capillaries come in, inundate this area. Then we have this collagen fiber, kind of like a matrix, a scaffold is built around this wound. And then that collagen fiber scaffolding becomes the base of the regeneration of that new epithelial tissue, the new tissue that's going to be replaced in this wound healing process. And so the scab that forms when you have a wound, when you have a cut, that is formed by the clotting proteins catching all the blood, the fibers in that blood. And so when you finally get to the end of this process, once that surface epithelium is regenerated, then that scab is going to come off by itself. You've probably had a scab before that you've pulled off before this whole process is finished. Notice that it starts bleeding again because in that case you're exposing these capillaries that have been reformed. And so the capillaries are going to start bleeding out because you haven't yet regenerated that epithelium, that epithelial tissue layer on top, and so it's going to bleed some more, going to clot until you finally get that epithelial layer built on there. In the case of fibrosis, where you're getting scar tissue, how much scar tissue you get, or whether you can see that scar tissue or not, is going to depend on the severity of the wound, where that wound happens, and those sorts of situations. That completes our section on cells and tissues. In the next lecture, we're going to go on and start talking about the systems. So we're now done with the introduction. We're now going to get into the different organ systems.